The low, amber light of La Famiglia was meant to feel intimate, but for Jane, it was a spotlight. She had been sitting alone for an hour, her own birthday. The sympathetic glances from the surrounding tables were like tiny, sharp needles against her skin. She clutched the worn strap of her purse, the smooth leather, a small, cold comfort. Just one more minute, she told herself. Then she would gather the shredded remnants of her dignity and leave. Just as she was about to slide out of the plush velvet booth, he arrived. Greg. He wasn't apologetic. He was drunk, and his face was a mask of irritation. "Couldn't you have waited at the bar?" he said, his voice loud enough to curdle the sophisticated atmosphere. The couple at the next table stopped talking. "Did you have to make a scene sitting here all alone like some pathetic loser?" A hot flush of shame crept up Jane's neck. She felt herself shrink into the booth. He slid in opposite her, his movements clumsy, reeking of whiskey and entitlement. He looked her up and down, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. "You always dress like a school teacher," he said, gesturing at her simple, tasteful dress. It was the best thing she owned. "Still playing with paste and glitter all day? When are you going to get a real job?" Each word was a deliberate, public dissection. He wasn't just late. He was punishing her for it, for existing, for being herself. Jane froze, the humiliation of physical weight pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. She could only sit there and take it, the quiet jazz of the restaurant a mocking soundtrack to her personal execution. Across the room, Peter watched. He had noticed the woman sitting alone an hour ago, her quiet patience a stark contrast to his usual clientele. He had felt a flicker of annoyance at the man who would stand up such a woman. But now, watching the open verbal abuse, his annoyance curdled into a cold, controlled fury. It was a familiar poison, one he had seen before. Greg's voice rose again. "You know what? You've ruined my mood. Let's go." He reached across the table and grabbed Jane's arm, his fingers digging into her soft skin with bruising force. The sudden pain was a shock, but it was the public ownership, the casual cruelty of the gesture that broke her paralysis. She flinched, a small wounded sound escaping her lips. The instant Greg's fingers tightened, a large, powerful hand landed on his shoulder. It wasn't a tap, it was the dead weight of a steel press. It was Peter. He didn't look at Greg. His eyes, hard as granite and black as night, were fixed on Jane, on her pale face, on the fear in her eyes. "Let go of her," he commanded. His voice was a low, lethal growl that cut through the music, a sound of pure, absolute authority. Greg, startled and confused, snatched his hand back from Jane's arm as if he'd been burned. He twisted in his seat to glare up at the intruder. "Who the hell are you?" he slurred, his drunken bravado a flimsy shield against the mountain of a man towering over him. Peter ignored him completely, as if he were a piece of furniture, an irrelevant insect buzzing in the periphery. He moved with a lethal grace, kneeling slightly beside the booth so he was level with Jane. His broad back created a solid physical barrier between her and Greg, blocking him from her view entirely. The world suddenly shrank to just the two of them. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice now surprisingly soft, a low rumble meant only for her. Jane, still reeling from the shock of it all, could only manage a small, shaky nod. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Satisfied with her answer, Peter rose to his full, intimidating height. He turned to face Greg for the first time, his expression utterly devoid of emotion. It was this chilling emptiness that was more terrifying than any open anger. "Her dinner is with me now," Peter stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. "You can leave." Greg's drunken arrogance flared. He stumbled to his feet, trying to puff out his chest. "She's my girlfriend. You can't just—" Peter smiled. It was a smile with no humor, no warmth. It was the baring of teeth, a predator's warning that did not reach his cold, dark eyes. He leaned in close to Greg, his voice dropping to a whisper so low it was almost inaudible, a secret threat delivered with surgical precision. No one else heard the words, but they saw the effect. The color drained from Greg's face. He went from belligerent to bone-white in a single heartbeat. A tremor ran through his body, and he stared at Peter with wide, terrified eyes, as if he had just seen a ghost. He stammered something that sounded like an apology, then scrambled backward, nearly tripping over a chair in his haste. Without another glance at Jane, he practically ran from the restaurant. The silence at the table was deafening. The other diners quickly averted their gazes, suddenly fascinated by their own menus. Peter slid into the seat Greg had just vacated. He didn't look at Jane's face. His gaze went directly to the angry red marks on her forearm, where Greg's fingers had been. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in a sign of tightly leashed violence. Finally, he lifted his eyes to hers. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming, pinning her in place. It was possessive, furious, and strangely protective. "He'll regret losing you," Peter said, but the tone wasn't one of comfort. It was a promise, a vow, and he'll regret touching you even more. "What did you say to him?" Jane asked, her voice a fragile whisper in the heavy silence that Greg had left behind. Peter's gaze flickered up from her arm, his eyes unreadable. "I just convinced him that his future would be healthier without you in it," he answered, the evasion as smooth and effortless as the way he signaled a waiter to their table. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream. The tainted remnants of her birthday dinner were swept away and replaced by an experience of quiet, attentive luxury. Peter didn't flirt. He didn't try to impress her with stories of his success or charm her with practiced lines. He simply took care of her. He asked the chef to prepare a special risotto he knew she would like. He had the waiter bring her a glass of a specific wine that perfectly complemented the dish. He spoke to her about art, about the history of the city, his voice a low, calming presence that slowly uncoiled the tight knot of humiliation in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She felt seen. She felt safe. When the meal was over, he didn't ask where she lived. He already knew. He escorted her to a black car waiting at the curb, the engine humming silently. The ride to her modest apartment building was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, no longer charged with tension. He walked her to her door. Under the dim, flickering light of the hallway, the spell of the evening began to fade, and the reality of the situation returned. "Thank you," she said softly. "For tonight. You didn't have to do any of that." "Yes, I did," he replied, his tone shifting, losing its softness and regaining a hard, resolute edge. He stood before her, his presence filling the narrow hallway. "What happened tonight cannot happen again. I won't allow it." Jane frowned, confused. "Greg won't bother me anymore. You made sure of that." "It's not about him," Peter said, his gaze intense. "It's about any man like him. I will not have you left alone and vulnerable." He took a small step closer. "I'm not asking for your permission, Jane. I'm informing you. From now on, you are under my care. Where you go, what you do, I will know. It's the only way to ensure no one raises a hand to you again." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was a declaration, an imposition of total omnipresent protection. It was terrifying. But deep down, a treacherous part of her found the idea of that absolute safety addictive. "You can't control my life," she protested weakly, the words lacking conviction even to her own ears. He leaned in, his face just inches from hers, his clean, masculine scent overwhelming her senses. "I don't want to control your life, Cara," he murmured, the Italian endearment a soft caress. "I want to make sure you have one." He reached into his jacket and produced a simple, heavy black card, pressing it into her palm, his personal number. "Call me if you need anything," he said, his thumb brushing against her skin for a fraction of a second, sending a jolt through her. But don't worry. Even if you don't, I'll be close. The next morning, Jane woke up feeling as though the previous night had been a strange, vivid dream. But the heavy black card with Peter's number on her nightstand was proof that it had been real. She went through her morning routine in a daze, the memory of his quiet intensity a constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. Around noon, her phone buzzed. It was a text from a mutual friend. "OMG, have you heard what happened to Greg? He got fired this morning, from Sterling and Finch. They just walked him out. The official reason was corporate restructuring, but everyone knows that's a lie. What did he do?" Jane's blood ran cold. Sterling and Finch was a high-powered investment firm. They didn't just fire people, they ejected them. She stared at the text, a sickening certainty dawning on her. It wasn't a coincidence. It was Peter. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number from the card. He answered on the first ring, his voice a calm. "Jane." "You got him fired," she accused, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. "I didn't ask you to ruin his life." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but it wasn't one of hesitation. It was one of chilling patience. "He put his hands on you," Peter said, his voice as cold and hard as polished stone. "His life was already ruined. He just didn't know it yet." He paused again, letting his next words land with deliberate, devastating weight. "I protect what's mine, Jane." The line went dead, but the words echoed in her mind, a possessive claim that was both terrifying and thrilling. What's mine? She felt like a piece on a chessboard she didn't even know she was playing on. The day held more surprises. Later that afternoon, she received a call from her landlord, Mr. Henderson, a notoriously difficult and miserly man who had been ignoring her calls about a persistent leak in her bathroom for months. "Miss Sullivan," he began, his voice dripping with an unfamiliar, sycophantic sweetness. "I am so sorry about the delay with that plumbing issue. It completely slipped my mind. Unacceptable. I'm sending my best crew over tomorrow morning to fix everything. No cost to you, of course. Anything you need, you just let me know." Jane was stunned into silence. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. What changed your mind?" "Oh, well," he stammered. "Let's just say the new building ownership has a real commitment to tenant satisfaction, a real hands-on approach." He hung up before she could ask what he meant. New building ownership. A cold dread, now becoming familiar, washed over her. He wasn't just watching her from afar. He was buying the world around her, reshaping it piece by piece to ensure her comfort and safety. That evening, as she was processing the day's events, there was a sharp knock on her door. It wasn't a person. It was a delivery man holding a single, elegant black box. She opened it cautiously. Inside, there were no flowers, no jewelry, no cliché gifts. There was a state-of-the-art, high-security deadbolt and a small, discreet security camera for her doorway. Tucked beneath them was a note, written on the same heavy cardstock as his business card. The handwriting was sharp and decisive. "The first step to feeling safe is in your own home. I'll handle the rest. P." Jane sank onto her sofa, the box in her lap. She looked from the new lock to her front door, then back to the note. His protection was total. It was invasive. It was suffocating. And it was the most terrifyingly effective thing she had ever experienced. Peter appeared at the end of her school day on Friday. Jane was wiping down a paint-splattered table when she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway of her classroom, a quiet storm in a perfectly tailored suit. The sheer force of his presence seemed to suck the air out of the cheerful primary-colored room. He wasn't in one of his black sedans. He had walked. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, a lie so blatant it was almost charming. "Let's get some coffee." It wasn't a question. She found herself grabbing her coat and bag, her protests dying on her lips. He didn't lead her to a trendy, upscale cafe. Instead, he guided her a few blocks away to a small, old-world bakery, Il Forno Dolce, the scent of baking bread and almond biscotti spilling onto the street. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Pietro! A stout, flour-dusted man behind the counter boomed, his face breaking into a wide grin. It's been too long. And who is this beautiful lady? Marco, this is Jane, Peter said, a hint of warmth entering his voice. Jane, this is Marco. He makes the best cannoli this side of Sicily. Away from the cold marble of his restaurant and the lethal aura of his power, Jane saw a different man. He was Pietro here. A man who knew the baker by name, who asked about Marco's wife and remembered that his youngest son had just started university. He was relaxed, his shoulders losing some of their rigid tension. He was, for the first time, simply human. They sat at a small table by the window, the late afternoon sun warming their faces. Jane, emboldened by this new, softer version of him, finally voiced the question that had been burning in her mind. Thank you for everything, she began, choosing her words carefully. But I have to ask, why are you doing all of this? Why do you care so much? Peter didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window at the people passing by, his coffee untouched. The easy warmth he'd shown with Marco evaporated, replaced by a shadow of something deep and painful. I had a younger sister, he said, his voice losing its hard, commanding edge, becoming rougher, quieter. Rose. She trusted people too easily. She fell for a man like your Greg. Charming on the outside, poison underneath. He paused, the memory clearly a physical weight on him. I was young. Arrogant. I saw the bruises she tried to hide. I heard the excuses she made for him. I thought she could handle it. I thought she would leave when she was ready. His jaw tightened. I didn't step in. He finally turned from the window to look at her, and for the first time she saw past the steel armor to the raw, unhealed wound beneath. The granite in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sea of regret. I found her in the hospital, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I was too late. The silence in the bustling bakery was suddenly profound. He held her gaze, his own vulnerability a shocking, silent confession. I made a promise at her grave, he said, the words thick with a grief that was still raw after all these years. Never again. Never again would I stand by while someone I was meant to protect was in danger. And in that moment, Jane understood. His obsession with protecting her wasn't about control or possession. It was about atonement. The following Saturday, Jane was in the middle of a controlled, colorful chaos. She was running a small art fair for her students in the school's courtyard, and as with any event organized on a shoestring budget, everything that could go wrong was. The cheap easel holding the welcome sign had collapsed, the juice pitcher had been knocked over, and a gust of wind kept threatening to send the children's watercolor paintings flying. She was stressed, overwhelmed, and trying to be everywhere at once. Then, as if from nowhere, help arrived. A team of 4 polite, powerfully built volunteers appeared. Within minutes, they had erected professional-grade display tents, set up a small but effective sound system, and laid out a spread of cookies and juice boxes for all the children. Jane stared, dumbfounded, as they moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. She saw him then. Peter was standing at the edge of the courtyard, leaning against an old oak tree, watching. He wasn't wearing a suit, but simple dark trousers and a soft cashmere sweater. He wasn't directing his men. He was just a silent, steady presence. He hadn't taken over her event. He had simply removed the obstacles, clearing the path so she could shine. The day was transformed. The children were ecstatic, the parents were impressed, and Jane was able to relax and enjoy the fruits of her labor. The only hiccup came when a disgruntled father, angry that his son hadn't won a Best Painting ribbon, began to argue with Jane, his voice rising with belligerent entitlement. "This is ridiculous! My son is a genius! This whole thing is rigged!" he boomed, causing a few of the nearby children to look over in fear. Before the situation could escalate, Peter moved. He didn't approach the father. He walked past him and knelt beside the man's young son, who was on the verge of tears. "Did you draw this spaceship?" Peter asked the boy, his voice low and kind, completely ignoring the fuming parent. The boy nodded shyly. "You have a lot of talent," Peter said, his gaze serious and respectful. "The engine placement is very smart. Keep practicing." The father, utterly disarmed by this stranger's unexpected kindness to his child, fell silent. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a flush of shame. He mumbled an apology to Jane and quickly led his son away. At the end of the day, as the last of the families departed, Peter stayed to help Jane pack up the remaining art supplies. The courtyard was quiet, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. "You handled that father brilliantly," she said, a genuine admiration in her voice. "Sometimes the best way to disarm a man is to show kindness to what he's supposed to be protecting," Peter replied, but his dark eyes were fixed on her as he said it. The words were a clear, deliberate double entendre, a reference to his own actions. He closed the small space between them. The air grew thick with an unspoken energy. He reached out, his hand gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her skin. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the possessive, claiming kiss she might have expected. It was soft, tentative, and full of a quiet admiration that stole her breath. It was a kiss that asked, not demanded. A kiss that tasted of respect and the promise of something more. The kiss in the schoolyard changed the current between them, turning the slow-burning embers of their connection into a steady, warming flame. The line between protector and protected blurred, replaced by a growing, undeniable intimacy. Jane found herself thinking about him constantly, not as the fearsome Mafia boss, but as the man who knelt to praise a child's drawing, the man whose quiet admiration made her feel more powerful than she ever had before. A week later, he made an offer she couldn't refuse. "I have a house on a lake, a few hours north," he said over the phone, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "It's quiet. No one knows about it. My only real refuge. Come with me for the weekend." It was a test, she knew. An invitation not just to a place but into his life, into the one corner of his world he kept separate from his dangerous profession. Her answer was a soft, immediate yes. The lake house was a revelation. It was a rustic, elegant cabin made of dark wood and stone, nestled among towering pines, its large windows overlooking a vast, serene expanse of water. There were no guards, no black cars, no hint of the life he led in the city. Here they were just Peter and Jane. The weekend was a blissful escape from reality. They cooked together in the large open kitchen, their bodies brushing against each other in an easy domestic dance. He taught her how to skip stones across the glassy surface of the lake, his hand warm and firm as it guided hers. At night, they sat by a crackling fire, and he told her the names of the constellations, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. She found herself falling in love, not with the myth or the power, but with the man who read history books before bed, and whose quiet laughter was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. But their peace was a fragile illusion. Miles away, a man named Vargas stewed in a bitter, vengeful rage. Peter had been systematically dismantling his drug operations, squeezing him out of the city with ruthless efficiency. Vargas was losing territory, money, and respect, a fatal combination for a man in his line of work. He needed leverage. He needed to find a weakness in the impenetrable fortress that was Peter. His spies had followed Peter out of the city. From a distance, through a long-lens camera, they watched the Mafia boss with the schoolteacher. They saw him laugh. They saw him touch her with a tenderness that was a shocking vulnerability. They saw him look at her in a way that told them everything they needed to know. Vargas had found his weakness. He didn't see Jane as a target to be eliminated. He saw her as a tool to be used, a crowbar to pry open Peter's world and shatter it from the inside. As Peter and Jane shared a bottle of wine on the dock, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, A camera shutter clicked silently from the woods across the shore. The intimate, unguarded moment was captured, stolen, and sent electronically to a man who would twist it into a weapon. The peace was already broken. They just didn't know it yet. They returned to the city late Sunday night, wrapped in the warm, peaceful glow of the weekend. The world of danger and secrets felt a million miles away. For the first time, Jane felt like she was part of a normal couple, and the feeling was intoxicating. A few nights later, they were having dinner at La Familia. The restaurant, once the site of her deepest humiliation, now felt like home. Peter had given them his most private booth, tucked away in a quiet alcove. Everything was perfect. The candlelight danced in his dark eyes, and the easy intimacy that had blossomed at the lake filled the space between them. Peter was more relaxed, more open than she had ever seen him. He leaned across the table, his hand covering hers, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and serious, "about the future. I'm moving more of my businesses into legitimate sectors, the construction company, the import-export firm. In a few years, maybe I can step away from the other side of things, completely." Jane's heart skipped a beat. He was talking about a real future, a future with her, away from the violence and the shadows. It was a dream she hadn't even dared to imagine. "Really?" she whispered. "Really," he confirmed, his gaze holding hers with a profound promise. A man can't live in the darkness forever, not when he's found a reason to seek the light. The moment was so perfect, so full of hope, that the sudden, sharp vibration of his phone on the table was a violent intrusion. He glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He never took calls during their dinners, but his expression shifted instantly. The relaxed, hopeful man vanished, replaced by the cold, lethal focus of the Mafia boss. He picked up the phone. It wasn't a call. It was a message from an unknown number. He opened it, and Jane watched as every ounce of color drained from his face. His hand tightened on hers, his grip suddenly painful. His body went rigid, his eyes locking on the screen with a look of pure, murderous fury. Without a word, he turned the phone and showed her the screen. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of them from the lake house, a candid shot of her laughing as he leaned in to whisper something in her ear. It was an intimate, stolen moment. A bright red circle was drawn crudely around her smiling face. She scrolled down with a trembling finger. The next image was a photo of her school, the cheerful, welcoming sign, the playground where her students played every day. Beneath the photos was a simple, chilling line of text. "You took my territory. Seems only fair I take yours. I see she likes children. It would be a shame if something happened to their school." The threat was a masterpiece of cruelty. It wasn't aimed at Peter. It wasn't even aimed directly at her. It was aimed at the innocent children she had dedicated her life to, the very heart of her world. Vargas hadn't just found Peter's weakness. He had found the most vicious way imaginable to exploit it. The change in Peter was instantaneous and terrifying. The warm, loving man who had just spoken of a future in the light vanished as if he had never existed. In his place was the cold, ruthless Mafia boss, his eyes turning to chips of ice. The hope that had filled the small booth moments before was replaced by a chilling, palpable menace. "The dinner is over," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. He threw a few bills on the table and pulled her to her feet, his grip on her arm firm but not painful, a silent command for obedience. The ride to his penthouse was a silent, suffocating ordeal. He didn't speak. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set like granite, his mind clearly racing, calculating, planning. Jane sat beside him, her heart pounding with a fear so profound it was nauseating. The threat against her school, against her children, echoed in her mind, a sickening drumbeat of terror. His penthouse, which had once seemed like a sleek modern palace, now felt like a fortress. As they stepped out of the private elevator, two large men in dark suits, men she had never seen before, were standing guard in the foyer. They nodded at Peter, their eyes cold and watchful. "You will not leave this apartment until this is over," Peter commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He led her into the vast living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows displaying a city that now felt a world away. "My men are posted on every floor, in the lobby and on the street. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out." He took her phone from her hand. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Security," he stated simply, his tone clinical. "Vargas could use it to track you, to listen. No calls, no internet. You are off the grid until I have him." A wave of panic washed over her. She felt trapped, isolated. "But my kids, the school, what's happening? You have to tell me," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "My men are handling it," he said, his voice dismissive, as he gently removed her hand. "The school is secure. That's all you need to know." The lack of information, the absolute control, the feeling of being a possession to be protected and locked away. It was suffocating. It scraped against the old, raw wounds left by Greg, awakening a trauma she thought she had overcome. She wasn't being protected. She was being imprisoned. "This isn't protection, Peter. This is a cage," she cried, her voice rising with a desperate, frantic energy. "You can't just lock me away. I'm not some fragile thing you can hide in a box." He spun to face her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his icy composure. It wasn't anger. It was a raw, desperate fear, the same haunted look he'd had when he spoke of his sister. "I know what's best," he yelled, his voice echoing in the cavernous room, the sound raw with the pain of his past. "I will keep you safe. I won't fail again." He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight, his eyes wild with a terror that had nothing to do with the present moment. He was seeing his sister. He was reliving his greatest failure. Before she could say another word, he was steering her toward the master bedroom suite. "You'll stay here, for your own good." He pushed her gently inside. The door, heavy and solid, clicked shut behind her. The sound of the lock turning was a final metallic thud of finality. She was alone, trapped by the very man who had sworn to set her free. Jane stood in the silent, luxurious prison, the click of the lock echoing in her ears. For a moment, she was paralyzed by a tidal wave of fear and fury. But then, another feeling rose to the surface, fierce and unyielding. Defiance. She was not Rose. She would not be a helpless victim in someone else's tragic story. She was a teacher, a protector in her own right, and her children were in danger. She refused to be locked away. She began to pace the room, her mind racing, assessing her situation with a clarity born of pure adrenaline. Peter, in his grief-stricken panic, had made a mistake. He had assumed she was weak. He had forgotten that she was smart, observant, and resourceful. He had posted a guard outside her bedroom door. She could hear the faint shuffle of his feet. Through the peephole, she saw he was young, barely out of his teens, his expression a mixture of boredom and nervousness. He was the weak link. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Jane put her plan into motion. She let out a small, choked gasp, then another, louder one. She stumbled back against a dresser, knocking a lamp to the floor with a loud crash. She slid down the wall, clutching her chest, her breathing becoming ragged, shallow, and loud. She was faking a panic attack, a full-blown asthma crisis, using every ounce of her limited acting ability to make it convincing. "Help!" she wheezed, the sound just loud enough to be heard through the door. "Please, I can't breathe." The shuffling outside the door stopped. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The young guard called out, his voice laced with alarm. "My purse!" Jane gasped, forcing a desperate, rattling cough. "Inhaler!" She heard the frantic fumbling with the key card, and then the door flew open. The young guard rushed in, his eyes wide with panic. "Where is it? Where's your purse?" "Over there," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the far side of the room. As he rushed past her to find the purse that wasn't there, Jane moved. In a single, fluid motion, she shot up from the floor, She didn't run for the open door. She snatched the security key card that he had carelessly left clipped to his belt. He spun around at the sound of her movement, his face a mask of shocked realization, but it was too late. She was already out the door, slamming it shut behind her. She didn't take the elevator. She knew it would be monitored. She sprinted for the service stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, swiping the stolen keycard to gain access. She ran down flight after flight of cold, concrete stairs, her only thought a frantic, repeating mantra. The school. Get to the school. Bursting out into a back alley, she didn't stop running. She flagged down the first taxi she saw, her mind a chaotic blur. She had no phone, no money, but she had to get there. She had to see for herself that her children were safe. When the taxi pulled up a block away from the school, she saw it. The street was lined with discreet black sedans. Men in dark suits stood at every corner, their gazes constantly scanning, their presence a silent, formidable perimeter. Peter had kept his word. The school was a fortress. A wave of relief washed over her, so profound it almost buckled her knees. But then she saw him. Across the street, leaning against a car and pretending to read a newspaper, was the man from the classroom, the father of the new student. He wasn't looking at the school. He was watching Peter's men, his lips moving as he spoke quietly into a hidden microphone in his collar. The relief curdled back into ice-cold terror. The threat was still here, active, and in that same horrifying instant, another realization crashed down on her. Peter would discover her escape. He wouldn't see it as an act of courage. He would see it as a betrayal. In his world of black and white loyalties, she had just defied his protection, broken his command, and run. He would think she didn't trust him. And in his mind, that might be the greatest sin of all. The moment Peter discovered Jane was gone, the cold, controlled fury he had maintained shattered into pure, blind panic. The young guard, pale and stammering, explained how she had tricked him, how she had fled. Peter's first thought was not that she was brave, but that she was a fool. His second, colder thought, fueled by years of paranoia and betrayal, was even worse. What if it wasn't foolishness? What if it was intentional? His mind, a machine built for strategy and war, raced through the darkest possibilities. Had she run to Vargas? Had she made a deal? The trust he had just begun to build was instantly poisoned by the brutal logic of his world. She had defied him, therefore she was a liability, an unknown variable. He slammed his fist onto his desk, the sound echoing the fracture in his own heart, a crack between the man who loved her and the Mafia boss who couldn't afford to trust anyone. Meanwhile, Jane stood frozen on the street corner, watching Vargas's man. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing, but her desperation was hotter. Peter's men were a shield, but they weren't a solution. Vargas was still out there, and the threat against the children remained. She couldn't hide behind Peter's walls and wait. She had to act. In a move of stunning, reckless courage, she walked across the street, directly toward the spotter. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Tell your boss I want to talk to him," she said, her voice trembling but clear, her chin held high. She was bluffing, projecting a confidence she was nowhere near feeling. Alone. The man, momentarily stunned by her audacity, recovered and smirked. He spoke quietly into his collar. A few minutes later, he looked back at her. "He agrees. A car will be here in 5 minutes." It was a trap. A deep, instinctual part of her knew it. But what choice did she have? She was hoping she could reason with him, offer herself as a hostage in exchange for the school's safety. It was a teacher's gambit, a desperate appeal to a humanity he likely didn't possess. The car arrived and took her to a derelict warehouse district by the waterfront. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay. At the same time, Vargas executed the masterstroke of his plan. He sent an anonymous text to Peter's personal phone. It contained a single address, the location of the warehouse, and a simple, damning message. Your girl is here to make a deal. You should come see what your loyalty is worth. The message was a perfectly crafted piece of psychological warfare. It confirmed Peter's darkest fears, framing Jane's desperate act of courage as a calculated betrayal. When Peter's car screeched to a halt outside the warehouse, his heart was a battlefield, torn between a white-hot rage at her perceived treachery and a gut-wrenching fear for her safety. His men fanned out, taking positions, but he waved them off, ordering them to hold. This was something he had to see for himself. He kicked open a side door and stormed in. The cavernous space was dimly lit, smelling of rust and stagnant water. And there she was, standing in the center of the room, her posture defiant, her face pale but determined. Facing her was Vargas, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. Vargas saw Peter, and his smile widened. "Ah, Pietro, so glad you could make it," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Your girlfriend and I were just getting acquainted. She came to make a deal. Seems she doesn't like your protection as much as you thought." Before Peter could process the scene, before he could utter a single word, Vargas moved with snake-like speed. He pulled a gun from his waistband, the metallic click deafening in the silence. He pressed the cold, dark muzzle against Jane's temple. "Now," Vargas said, his eyes glittering with victory as he looked at Peter. "Let's talk about my territory." "Let her go, Vargas," Peter said, his voice dangerously calm, a low growl that vibrated with barely suppressed violence. He held his hands up slightly, a universal sign of non-aggression that was a stark contrast to the murderous fury in his eyes. "This is between you and me." Vargas laughed, a short, ugly sound that echoed off the high steel rafters. "She is the thing between you and me now, Pietro. You care about her. You went soft. She's your weakness." He pressed the gun harder against Jane's temple, making her flinch. "Just like your sister was." The name, Rose, hit Peter like a physical blow. For a fraction of a second, his control shattered. The carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled, and all Vargas saw was not a Mafia boss, but a man ripped open by his oldest, most painful wound. And in that flicker of agony, Vargas knew he had won. "So here's the deal," Vargas said, savoring his moment of absolute power. "You're going to get on your knees." The command was so outrageous, so unthinkable, that a stunned silence filled the warehouse. Peter's men, hidden in the shadows, tensed, their hands tightening on their weapons, waiting for the signal to unleash hell. Jane stared at Peter, her eyes wide with horror. "Get on your knees," Vargas repeated, his voice a triumphant sneer. "You will kneel, and you will give it all back. My territory, my roots, my business. You will surrender everything. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let her live to see another sunrise." This was the ultimate humiliation. Not just defeat, but utter subjugation. He was demanding that Peter sacrifice not just his empire, but his very identity as a man who bowed to no one. Jane shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "No, Peter, don't," she mouthed silently, her voice stolen by terror. "Don't do it for me." Peter's eyes locked with hers. The rage was gone, replaced by a look of profound, heartbreaking resolve. He saw her fear, her plea, and he made his choice. To the absolute shock of Jane, of Vargas, and of his own men watching from the darkness, Peter's rigid posture softened. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to the grimy concrete floor. First one knee, then the other. The king was kneeling. The man who had built an empire on strength and fear was on his knees, brought low by his love for a schoolteacher. It was an act of surrender so total, so absolute, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. "All right," Peter said, his voice hoarse, broken. "You win." Vargas's smile was a grotesque mask of victory. He kept the gun pressed firmly to Jane's head, his gaze fixed on his vanquished foe. "I know," he gloated. Peter was on his knees, a broken king before a triumphant usurper. But as he looked up, past Vargas's gloating face, his eyes met Jane's. In the midst of her terror, she saw him do something small, deliberate, and completely out of place. He blinked. Once. Slowly. It wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a signal. The act of kneeling had never been about surrender. It was a strategic repositioning. It was the ultimate misdirection, playing on Vargas's ego, drawing his entire focus onto the spectacle of his enemy's humiliation. In the split second that Vargas was savoring his victory, his attention locked on the kneeling man before him. Peter moved. He didn't lunge at Vargas. He didn't reach for a hidden weapon. He exploded forward and to the side, slamming his entire body into a towering rusted stack of empty oil barrels. The sound was cataclysmic, a deafening crash of metal on concrete that echoed through the warehouse like a thunderclap, a chaotic, disorienting wave of noise. It was the signal. From the shadows, Peter's men erupted into action. The warehouse plunged into controlled chaos, but Peter's objective was singular. He ignored the shouts, the struggle, the fight for his empire. He ignored Vargas completely. His only target was Jane. As Vargas spun around, momentarily stunned by the noise, Peter was already moving. He covered the distance to Jane in 3 powerful strides. He didn't try to fight. He simply grabbed her, spun her around, and shielded her with his own body, absorbing a glancing blow from a panicked swing of Vargas's gun. He grunted in pain, but didn't slow. Half carrying, half dragging her toward the safety of a concrete pillar as his men swarmed and subdued Vargas's crew. His redemption wasn't in winning the war. It was in proving, with absolute certainty, that her safety was the only battle that mattered. With Jane securely behind cover, Peter finally turned back to the fight. He moved with a cold, brutal efficiency, disarming Vargas and slamming him against a wall. The man who had held all the power moments before was now helpless, pinned by a force of pure, focused rage. Peter held a gun to Vargas's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Peter, no!" Jane cried out from behind him. He looked at Vargas's terrified face, then back at Jane. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the lust for vengeance warring with the man he wanted to be for her. He lowered the gun. "The police are on their way," Peter said, his voice a low, chilling growl as he pressed Vargas's face against the rough wall. "I called them before I came in. You'll spend the rest of your miserable life in a cage, thinking about the empire you lost. It's a fate worse than death." He chose justice, not revenge. He chose her. He pushed away from Vargas, leaving him for his men to handle, and stumbled back toward Jane. He was bleeding from a gash on his arm, his suit was torn, and he was breathing heavily, but his eyes were clear. They were focused only on her. He reached her, his hands coming up to frame her face, his gaze searching hers with a desperate, raw urgency. "Are you safe?" he asked, the words a ragged whisper. It was the only question that mattered. The sterile, white room of the hospital's private wing was a world away from the grime and chaos of the warehouse. A nurse was just finishing stitching the gash on Peter's arm, her movements efficient and professional. Jane sat in a chair beside him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the quiet, fragile space for the words that needed to be said. When the nurse left, a heavy silence filled the room. Peter was the first to break it. He looked at his bandaged arm, then at her, his expression stripped of all its usual armor. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet, raw. "I tried to lock you in a cage to keep you safe, and I almost lost you because of it. I was so afraid of failing again, of being helpless like I was with Rose, that I became the one thing I hated." He finally met her gaze, his own eyes full of a profound, gut-wrenching regret. "Protection without trust is just a prison." "I'm sorry, Jane. Can you forgive me?" Tears welled in Jane's eyes. She set her cup down and moved to sit on the edge of his bed. "I'm sorry, too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I should have trusted you. I should have known you were handling it. I ran because I was so afraid of being weak, of being a victim again. But the strongest thing I could have done was stay and fight beside you. Peter reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. I don't want you to fight beside me, he said softly. I want to fight for you, but with you telling me how. I want to be your shield, Jane, not your cage. He used his free hand to reach for his jacket, which was draped over a nearby chair. He pulled out a folded legal document and handed it to her. Confused, she opened it. It was the deed to a small commercial property. The address was familiar. It was the bakery. Il Forno Dolce. I bought it, he explained, watching her face. Marco wants to retire. I want to gut the space, renovate it, turn it into a community arts center for the neighborhood kids, a safe place, with free classes, tutoring, maybe even free meals. He paused, his gaze intense. But it needs someone to run it, someone with a heart big enough to fill it with life. Jane looked from the deed up to his hopeful, vulnerable face, a slow, watery smile spreading across her lips. Is this a job offer, mister? Pietro, she asked, her voice teasing, but her eyes shining with tears of joy. It's a partnership offer, he corrected, his voice a low, serious murmur. In everything. He leaned forward, his face just inches from hers, his gaze searching hers for an answer. Say yes, Jane, he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of his hope. Say you'll build a future with me. 1 year later, the scent of baking bread and wet paint mingled in the air. The Rose Petal Art and Bread Workshop, named in honor of Peter's sister, was a vibrant, noisy, joyful hub in the heart of the neighborhood. The once quiet bakery had been transformed into a sprawling community center, with a state-of-the-art kitchen providing free meals on one side and a bright sunlit art studio on the other. Jane stood in the center of it all, a beloved and respected leader. She was no longer just a teacher. She was the director, the heart and soul of a place that was changing lives. She moved through the room, praising a child's clay sculpture here, helping another with a brushstroke there, her presence a warm, calming force. Peter arrived quietly, leaning against the doorframe, a soft, proud smile on his face as he watched her. He was still a man who commanded respect and inspired fear in the city's underworld, but here, in this sanctuary she had built, he was simply Jane's partner. He had funneled his power, his resources, and his fierce protective instincts into this place, into her vision. His ferocity was now a shield for the innocent. Later that evening, after the last of the children had gone home, they stood together in the quiet studio. The setting sun streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows across the paint-splattered floor. Jane was 6 months pregnant, her belly a gentle, happy curve beneath her dress. Peter came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his hands protectively on her stomach. He pressed his cheek against her hair, breathing in her familiar scent. Look at what we built, he whispered, his voice a low, reverent murmur against her ear. A legacy, she replied softly, leaning back against his solid chest. Not of fear, but of hope. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. The love in her eyes was steady, deep, and sure. I love you, she said. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that still made her heart flutter. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss, filled with the quiet certainty of their shared future. I know, he answered against her lips, the words no longer a possessive claim but a simple, profound truth. And it's my job to make sure you always feel this way, loved and safe. They had found their balance. He was her shield, and she was his heart. Together, they were no longer just a protector and the protected, but true partners, building a life and a legacy that was stronger and more beautiful than anything they could have ever achieved alone.